On the last episode of the Pressure Pod, we addressed this topic. I wanted to come back to it and talk about it really kind of from a different angle. So let me start with a question. Can you remember the last story? Maybe it was a movie or a book or a YouTube video. I don't know. The last story that moved you. All right, think about that. What's the last story that moved you? Okay, now let me ask you another question. Can you remember the last sermon you preached? I'm kidding, but you might remember it immediately. What about the last three sermons? What do you think would happen if we surveyed your church and asked them if they remember what last week's sermon was about? We're not going to do it. That would be painful to get that response, probably. You know, it's interesting. We can all remember our favorite stories. We can remember the stories that moved us, that changed us, that drew us in emotionally. But we can't really remember many of the sermons that we've heard. And I think that's the tension right there. That's why we were talking about sermons that don't stick this week and how to fix it. And I think we can fix it with one powerful shift. And of course, the answer is with story. I know how it feels, that pressure to preach clear and compelling biblical truth. I mean, it is a pressure cooker. But if your people forget it by Monday or Tuesday, well, what's the real point? I mean, seriously, what's the point? Something's obviously not working. And honestly, I don't think it is your ability, your skill. I think it's a model that almost all of us have inherited. Here's kind of what's really probably going on. Most of us were taught to preach like professors. 3 points, subpoints, Greek terms, bulletproof logic. And listen, don't get me wrong. I love good theology. When I went to seminary, I have a seminary master's, and I have a doctorate in theology. I took preaching a couple of times. I vividly remember my first preaching class. We had to write a sermon, of course, and we had to deliver it on camera. I delivered it in a room, and so I just was able to, give the professor the recording. He gave me a C on it because I didn't do 3 points and a poem. I didn't follow the 3-point exegetical whatever. And I didn't say anything. And then a week later, I emailed the professor and I said, don't look back at my message at all. Don't open it back up. But can you remember what it was about? Can you remember the point? And can you remember the application? He wrote me back and regurgitated almost the entire sermon to me. The exact point I was making, the single point, the application of it. He remembered all of it. And then he changed my grade to an A. Actually, I think he only did a B plus because I still didn't follow the way that he was teaching. But the point was made. There is a different way to do this because preaching is not about information. It's not about information transfer, right? Your people, they're not students, they're humans. And humans are wired for story. I mean, think about it. Jesus didn't just tell people about the kingdom. Do you remember what he said? He would always say things like, let me tell you a story. Why? Because story is sticky. I mean, of course, Jesus knows that, but we know it too. I mean, the truth wrapped in a narrative really can move a heart and a head, but not just the head. So there's a simple shift I would like to encourage you to consider. What would happen if we started to preach for the heart by preaching through story? Let me kind of unpack this a little bit. What if we allowed the biblical narrative to do the hard work, do the heavy lifting? Like, what if we walked people through the stories in the Bible like they're in it? What if we could help them feel these stories, not just hear some of these stories? What if instead, and listen, I like topical preaching. I think there's good and bad ways to do that. But instead of just going through a book of the Bible or choosing a topic like relationships and picking and choosing scriptures, what if we just focused on biblical characters, biblical narratives? If you read through biblical stories, you'll find there is a common structure that they follow. And the reason is because all stories follow this common structure. It's really in 4 scenes. Scene 1 is the conflict. Scene 2 is the response. Scene 3 is God's movement. And then scene 4 is the takeaway for us. When we teach kind of a biblical narrative, Honestly, it makes the message easier to prepare and write anyway, because great narratives, biblical narratives are great ones, they already have the conflict, the response, God's move, and then we add the takeaway to it. It already has so much of the content architecture that we need for a sermon. And then, of course, during it, we get to pull out the principles that we're seeing in the story as we write ourselves into it. So we don't leave people in the story, but we pull them in and then we bring them out with the truth so they can apply it in their life. I mean, kind of as a bonus idea, I think it'd be incredible for you to consider, maybe you're already doing this, but maybe take 3 or 4 biblical characters a year and teach a series on each one. You know, if you do Joseph from the Old Testament, it's the longest narrative, running consecutive narrative in Scripture. I mean, that could be 6 or 8 weeks. I like 4 to 6 max, but you know, you could do easily 4, you could do 5 or 6 on that. Ruth, Peter. I mean, pick a person and unpack their story week by week for people and pull out the principles from their story and then help people apply it in their life. I mean, really, it's that simple. I mean, each week could be one element of their story with one takeaway and one clear next step. And here's what I think you'll find, I think you can trust me when I tell you this, your people will probably remember that message more than any of the other messages. It's not because you're not working hard, but stories resonate, stories stick. And more important than anything, because the story sticks, people are more apt to start living it out in their life. Here's what I'd love for you to consider doing with this. I'd love for you to try to build your next sermon around a biblical story, not a topical outline. Now, when I say that, it could be that you are in a topical story series, or a topical series, and who knows, but pick a story in the Bible, pick a person, a narrative, and allow that to be what you teach to prove the point that or the principle that you're trying to focus on. Pick a biblical story. Focus less on explaining it and more on immersing people in it. Let's bring people into the story. One of my favorite messages I've ever done, I won't tell you the whole thing, I won't bore you with it, but I began with, I want you to imagine that we are alive 2,000 years ago. And I want you to imagine that you bump into a guy named Paul. And Paul is in prison. And you meet Paul. And you begin striking up some conversation. And eventually it turns into a friendship. Well, I told the entire story of Paul being in prison, walking out, being taken out, on the way to his execution. And you were the person in the story with him. And Paul is beginning to wonder. I preached this in the sermon. Paul's beginning to ask you, I'm about to die. They're about to kill me. I'm going to be executed. Is it even worth it? Was it worth it? All the suffering, all the persecution, all the jail, all the writing, all the churches, all the problems. It doesn't feel like it's made a difference. I'm not even sure it was worth it. And then imagine you were the guy with Paul. And you said, Paul, you have no idea. I got to see into the future. You have no idea. And unpacking that in a way that not just tells the story of Paul, but places people in the story. It immerses them. And that is so sticky. Another thing you could maybe try this week, let the truth emerge from the tension of the story. This is exactly what Jesus did. Remember, Jesus, I said this in the last episode, but Jesus would, people would, ask Jesus a question, what is the kingdom like? And he would say, let me tell you a story, Jesus, what is the kingdom like? A man had 2 sons and one wanted his inheritance early and left. All of these things are stories. And we call them, parables because they're, a made up story with an eternal meaning. But because there was a great story, the tension in the story emerged for people and it pulled them into it. So let the truth, God's truth, emerge from the tension of the narrative. And here's the last thing for you to consider trying. What if you could just give your people one sticky, clear application out of it? That's it. We're not trying to have 3 points. We're not trying to belabor this thing. Tell the story, talk about the one principle, and give people 1 point of application from it. You don't need to change your theology. You really just need to maybe preach a little more like Jesus. And you trust that story will do what your bullet points really are never going to be able to do. Listen, if you're kind of under the pressure of sermon prep, maybe staff fatigue, or if you're just wondering if your leadership and preaching is landing, I'd love to help. It's what I do for a living. I work with pastors just like you to relieve the pressure and build structures that really align with your values and your mission. You probably know this already. I have lots of resources. Just go to gavinadams.com, lots of resources there. I also, though, host monthly pressure valve sessions. And this month, we're talking about the pressure of preaching. So make sure you get that information. Make sure you join us for that 1 hour absolutely free webinar. And if you want to dig deeper into writing and crafting sticky messages, sticky sermons, I've got a leadership lab next month, the month of September, on that topic. We're going to meet for 5 weeks with pastors just like you, and we are going to learn together how to write and teach sermons that stick. So until next time, preach the story. Let the truth stick.